across England within 2 years.
The pilot site for the new NHS helpline in Lancashire is based at the headquarters of the county's ambulance service. Open 24 hours a day, all year round, calls will at first be directed to this temporary office.
Good morning, NHS Direct, Barbara speaking. How may I help you?
Trained operators will take the caller's details before passing them on to nurses based in 2 local hospitals for advice. It's hoped not only will patients benefit from the service, it'll also ease the pressures on the NHS.
I think we will find that waiting times in A&E departments may well be reduced through people getting easier and faster advice over the phone at home. And I also think that some of our stretched GP out of our services may also find some benefits because people will get the right advice without necessarily having to call out doctors.
Right, you've got an eye problem. Have you got any double vision?
At Chorley Hospital, nurse Vicky Round is using a special computer program to help her make a rough diagnosis and give basic advice.
A lot of people looking just for general advice and reassurance, I think, mainly, about their problem, be it either small or large, and to know that they are actually going to do the right thing.
Most patients seem to relish the chance of getting quick information rather than having to come to casualty.
I think it's brilliant, really well needed, especially for mothers with young children.
I'll use it, yeah.
Ministers hope these helplines will actually reduce the numbers of people attending A&E departments inappropriately. But paradoxically, they could actually increase the numbers as more people are discovered in need of treatment. Whatever the result of these pilots, the government is committed to roll out the scheme nationwide over the next few years. Richard Hannaford, BBC News, in Chorley in Lancashire.
One of Britain's largest unions is launching a campaign to ensure that the minimum wage extends to those under 21.
Rhinos, for instance, are allowed to wander in an enclosure as big as the whole of London Zoo. It's a stark contrast with conditions in many European zoos. The RSPCA secretly filmed these tigers being kept in cramped cages in Naples. Just one example of what they describe as appalling conditions in several EU countries. 5 member states have no laws at all covering zoos, while Britain has some of the toughest rules.
What matters is giving animals a very, very rich environment. You can make animals impoverished and you can demean them by giving them a lot of emptiness. What you have to do is make sure that that environment is rich and reflects their own needs, particularly their needs that they would fulfill in a wild environment.
Later today, European environment ministers will discuss a British proposal for compulsory licensing and inspection of zoos, but with no legally binding Europe-wide welfare standards.
Some zoos are worse than others in every country, and what we want to do is to lift up the general standard. And what we're arguing is that this helps us do our conservation work for animals from endangered species.
Some animal welfare groups won't be satisfied with the limited measures to regulate European zoos being pushed as a compromise by British ministers in Brussels today. But with some countries still resisting any form of regulation, it's the only proposal which stands a realistic chance of starting to improve the lives of animals in captivity in Europe. Tim Hirsch, BBC News, Whipsnade in Bedfordshire.
And David Bowles of the RSPCA joins me now from Whipsnade Zoo. David Bowles, why do you think standards are apparently so much worse in other European countries?
Because at the moment it's left completely to the discretion of each member state whether to have legislation on zoos or not. So we've got huge discrepancies from the UK, which has quite good legislation, down to countries like Italy, Greece and Portugal, which have no legislation at all. So it wasn't surprising when the RSPCA went to zoos in those countries. We found some of the worst conditions, both in welfare terms and in health terms, with animals in zoos there.
Do you think it's right that a British organisation like yours should be lecturing other European countries on the standards in their zoos?
We're not lecturing other countries. What we're saying is that zoos are one of the few wildlife areas in European Union where there is no legislation. And what we want to see is a harmonisation of the standards in all countries in the EU. We want to see the countries in the south come up to the standards which we have maintained in the UK and the north of Europe. And unless we have binding legislation with welfare standards, I'm afraid the RSPCA will go back to those countries in 5 years' time and we'll see there's been no change and we're still seeing the same welfare problems.
So you're not entirely happy with the ideas that are being put forward by Britain at the Environment Ministers meeting in Brussels today?
we think it's a good step forward. We need to have binding legislation which would set up an inspection and licensing scheme. Of course, what the RSPCA would prefer is that there were welfare standards attached to that as well. I mean, it would be all very well to have zoos being inspected and enforced, but unless you've got those standards, it will still be left up to the individual member states as to what level of standards they will allow in their zoos. And we fear that those standards will still be poor in countries like Greece and Italy.
David Bells, thanks very much indeed.